My name is Doug Cook. I'm the Education Events Coordinator for NOFA Mass, and I am coming from Pawtucket Land in the town currently known as South Hamilton, Massachusetts. And tonight we are excited to introduce Laura Davis and Marco Thomas, and they're going to help us understand choosing mineral and biological amendments. We just want to take a moment to thank all of our sponsors, especially Chelsea Green Publishing. Neptune's Harvest is also a sponsor tonight, as well as Ward's Nursery. And if you really enjoy this event, please consider becoming a NOFA Mass member. At this time, I'd like to introduce Laura Davis. Hi, Laura. Thanks for joining us. And you can take over your screen share.
Okay, hi, everybody. I'm Laura. I am the farmer at Long Life Farm, as well as a board and staff member of NOFA Mass. And I am going to focus on speaking slowly so all of our interpreters can interpret what I'm saying, and so our Spanish speakers don't miss anything. So I'm going to try and not speak as fast as I normally do. So bear with me. Okay, just to introduce my farm, Long Life Farm is in Hopkinton, Mass, and we operate on 2¼ acres. We are certified organic, and we have not tilled our beds for the last 4 years. Our business is made up about 55% CSA farm shares and the other half in farmers market sales. We currently have a high tunnel, a smaller tunnel, and a seedling greenhouse. We've been utilizing the Albrecht method of mineralizing soil since 2011. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit about adding amendments. The type of strategy that we use in the Albrecht method is to address any limiting factors your soil has that will prevent your food from having the minerals and nutrients that your body needs to be strong. And we produce about 30,000 pounds of produce on our farm. We just celebrated our 10-year anniversary. These are the 3 areas I just want to highlight up front. The 3 key pillars to soil health and healthy food. There's really 3: physical, or you want to make sure that there's no compaction in your soil, that your soil has good aggregates, that it's not just all powdery. It needs to be sticking together. And you want good water infiltration. You want a good heavy rain to go down and not cause flooding or erosions. You want to have a good home for microbes. And I'm so excited that I'm doing this presentation with the biology expert and talking about the microbes after I get done. So look forward to that. The second part of the key pillars is the biological. And that really is all about the little farmers underneath the soil that help make nutrients available. Those are the bacteria, the fungi, the nematodes, and the protozoa. They need to make the nutrients available to our plants. And the chemical really is the amendment. That's what we're talking about in terms of adding amendments. We want a balanced approach to our minerals and trace elements. And in order to do that, we need to think about the cation exchange capacity. So I'm going to talk about that particular term that you will see on your soil test reports. Above all, these three key pillars, soil organic matter impacts all 3 of them. So soil organic matter is extremely important to the physical, biological, and chemical pillar of your soil. So let's talk about chemical analysis or soil testing. And it's very important that you don't shoot in the dark. Don't guess about what your soil is missing or what you should be applying. I know that oftentimes backyard gardeners, believe that that compost and maybe a little bit of kelp or other type of amendment is the best thing for their garden. But if you don't need those items, then you're really just, throwing money down the drain. And having an excess of any one mineral can often be a limiting factor if you get too much, because it can impact if you have way too much phosphorus, for example, because you've used compost, manure-based compost for the last 20 years, that particular excess of phosphorus can definitely impact the availability of other minerals and trace elements. So you want to make sure you take a soil test. I generally recommend farmers to do those every year. Backyard gardeners can certainly do them as a baseline once every 2 years or every 3 years. It's a really important step. So especially if you're starting a new garden. If you're starting a new garden, you need to be concerned about lead, especially if it's near a house or a garage or other urban setting where there's been buildings. You need to get that soil tested and make sure that you're testing for lead. So there's 3 different soil tests I'm just going to show you an example of tonight so that you know what they look like and what the costs are to take a soil sample. Logan Labs is the lab that we use most often. They do a test called the MELIC 3, and their tests range between 25 and 30, depending upon how many trace elements you want to know about. UMass Amherst certainly is a good spot to get your soil test. They use a different type of test called the Modified Morgan. Their test is $20, but I highly recommend that you get the add-on calculation for the organic matter. This is a very important term and something that you absolutely need to know for your soil. The nice thing about UMass Amherst is that they will include the lead test on that soil test, and they will also give you some recommendations for amendments. So you don't really have to think too much about that. University of Maine is another really good soil testing lab. They do either the MELIC 3 or Modified Morgan. The reason I mention that is that you get a test from one lab one year and another lab another year. One may use the Modified Morgan, the other one use MELIC 3. You can't compare those 2 tests from year to year. They're completely different logic. So you want to make sure to if you want to compare from year to year to get the same type of test each year. University of Maine has a cost of between $18 and $25 for their test. The thing I like about their tests is that they have a box where you can check for high tunnel, and they will look at your test a little bit differently than they would an outside standard soil test. They'll also do a microbial biomass for another add-on of $12, which is great, because when you think about how biologically active your soil is, that can give you a good gauge. They give you a spectrum of numbers to compare for the biomass indication and tell you based upon your biomass number how much compost they recommend, from none to several inches. You can do lead testing there too. That's another add-on of $12. And if you really are concerned about possible contamination of your soil, they do a complete adsorbed metals test there, which includes lead, but also other metals like cadmium and arsenic. So those are 3 really good choices nearby that you can utilize. So just to show you some examples of the UMass test, I've got some blue arrows here just pointing at some important things that you want to look at on your soil test. The cation exchange capacity is really important, and we're going to talk about that more in detail in a few moments. I'll show you another slide. But what that means is it's your soil's ability to hold on to minerals. And that's very important when you think about whether or not you need to fertilize over the growing season. If you're soil is very sandy, you most likely will have a low cation exchange capacity. 10 is not is neither low nor high. 12 is about the number we're looking for. And if you have a, let's say, a 4 cation exchange capacity, that means you're going to need to side dress your plants and fertilize a couple of more times during the season after transplanting, because the soil just can't hold on to minerals. This is also a lead test here. You can see in this other blue arrow, the lead measurement, and UMass Amherst wants you to have below 22 on that score. This is the University of Maine soil testing service, and they will automatically put in the organic matter, and that's an important number for you. The organic matter not only gives you the ability for better soil fertility, but also water holding capacity and food for microbes, which we're going to talk about later. This particular test also has the cation exchange capacity down here in the middle at the bottom. This one is a little bit lower than that last one. This is 8.4. And that I would probably want to be fertilizing a couple of times after transplantation. They give a lead result as well. And they also have organic matter down here, and they give you a normal range that you want to work towards. This level of 5.4 is pretty low. We want to be between 8 and 12. And this last one is from Logan Labs, and this is actually a soil test of my farm from last fall. And you can see that my exchange capacity is pretty low, of 5.5, 6, 7. I have somewhat sandy soil, and I do often have to make sure to side dress during the middle of the season, especially for plants that are in the ground all season, like tomatoes and peppers and eggplants. Organic matter here, 8 to 12 is the goal. When I started farming 10 years ago, I was around 3 or 4, and I'm happy to say that they have gone up, and they continue to go up with our practices that we utilize on our farm. Lots of mulch, lots of cover crop, and no tilling. And again, the base saturation of exchange sites is here. So if you think about an exchange capacity, well, let me just show the picture. It might be a little easier. This is the picture of cation exchange capacity. And if you think about the round brown section, that's a particle of sand or clay or humus. And these little dashes here on the soil colloid are negative ions, and they will attach to positive ions that are in your minerals. So calcium, magnesium, potassium, this is sodium. Those all have positive charges, and they will attach to a negative charge. But the problem is that sand doesn't have very many negative charges. They don't have many exchange sites to be able to hold on to those minerals. As we move up into a clay particle, there's a lot more exchange sites or negative ions. And as we move further up to humus, there's many, many more exchange sites that can hold on to minerals. So you can see if you have a high exchange capacity, you're going to be able to hold on to a lot of minerals. And that's really important for the microbes to be able to make those available to your plants and your roots. So if you think about both the exchange capacity and your organic matter, this is sort of a spectrum of characteristics that would enable your soil to be more fertile or less fertile. And very high exchange capacity are associated with high organic matter. Being more fertile, they tend to have more humus and stable carbon. they hold a lot more minerals and they hold a lot more water. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, low CEC, low organic matter, you have less fertility. It's very sandy. You don't have a lot of carbon for the microbes to have a home in and eat, and minerals will leach away. So they will, many of those will wash away with a hard rain. So when we think about the base saturation, we want a certain percentage of those exchange sites to hold calcium and a certain number to hold magnesium, potassium, and sodium. This equation is from Charles Albrecht, who was a soil scientist in the 20s and 30s. He was based in Missouri. And he did a lot of research on what made up the ideal soil for growing food and to ensure that humans had enough nutrients in their diet. And so did animals. So if all of you have trouble sleeping at night, you can read the Albrecht papers. It's several volumes of his work, but this is a logic or a theory that we utilize at NOFA in order to give soil soil and amendment recommendations. We want the calcium to be over 60 to 68%. And oftentimes soils can have, over 70%, and that's not a bad thing. Magnesium should be 12 to 20%, and potassium should be between 3 and 6% of the exchange site. So think back to those pictures I just showed you of all of the negative ions. We want sodium to be below 3%. Oftentimes we'll see high tunnels that have not had the plastic taken off in a while to get some rain and snow. Oftentimes they will be above 3%. So that's something that we need to watch out for. And the hydrogen will automatically itself depending upon how many sites calcium, magnesium, and potassium have taken for themselves. If that base saturation is well balanced, the pH in the soil will naturally land at the ideal pH for vegetables, 6.3 to 6.4. And this is, again, the Albrecht science for the ideal soil for plant, animal, and human nutrition. Okay, so what minerals and trace elements do we need? Well, if your deficits on your soil report are calcium, magnesium, and potassium, those are automatically calculated to how much you need or how much you're deficit in. Those are calculated automatically on the Logan Labs soil report. So you don't need to do that math because those are the major three. Sulfur, we look for having about 75 parts per acre. You often on your soil report will see parts per million, and we want to convert that to pounds per acre by multiplying by 2. Phosphorus levels should be around 150 parts per acre. Oftentimes you see these numbers at the 400, 500, 600 range because of the amount of years that people have used manure-based compost. And that can limit, as I mentioned earlier, the uptake of other minerals. Boron is a really important trace element that is responsible for your beets sizing up, but that it also is synergistic with calcium, and it is definitely a needed trace element. I didn't mention all the traces here, but the most important ones are boron, manganese, and zinc. So those are the numbers that Albrecht recommends that we have in our soil. Okay, so how do we know which amendments to use? Well, that is the complicated part. So the place to always start is, do you need magnesium? If the answer is yes, Then the second question is, do you also need potassium and sulfur? If the answer is yes, then you will automatically go to the amendment called Supplemental. Sometimes people call it KMAG. It has 3 different minerals in this amendment. So it has magnesium, potassium, and sulfur. And it has about 11% magnesium, 22% potassium, and 22% sulfur. So that is a if yes, then this type of question that you have to ask yourself. If you need magnesium but not potassium and sulfur, then the second question is, do you also need calcium? If that answer is yes, we might often recommend dolomitic lime, which has a small amount of magnesium, but also has a lot of calcium in it. Another question might be, are your calcium levels okay, but still need magnesium? Then some gardeners have enjoyed using Epsom salts, which is mostly magnesium. And it's always nice to have that around the house for those sore muscles as well to soak in. Unless magnesium is really low, we sometimes ignore the excess because sometimes too much magnesium can make the soil very tight or compact. And then a couple of other considerations that you want to think about is your pH. If you have a very high pH above 7, we often will recommend people use some elemental sulfur, and that will actually bring your pH down a slight amount. And it will help build up as your sulfur reserve. Oftentimes soils are very deficient in sulfur as well. If your pH is below 6 and you don't want to grow blueberries there, then you will want to definitely add lime, some calcium. And the other, so that would be either a high cal lime to amend the calcium and also to bring up the pH. Now, if you perhaps have low potassium, but no deficiency in magnesium, then you would want to use potash of sulfate. Some people call this potassium sulfate. And oftentimes it may be the only amendment that you need if you've addressed your calcium and magnesium. Because potassium is one of those things that will leach out of the soil. So we never want to put potassium or nitrogen on in the fall. That's always in the springtime. Other amendments you can put on in the fall. Key to whatever amendments that you are going to use is to make sure that they are safe for organic use. Oftentimes these amendment companies will pay OMRI to test their product to make sure it's safe, and then they are allowed to use the OMRI label, which stands for the Organic Materials Review Institute. Just because it does not have an OMRI label does not mean that you can't use it. It may in fact be approved for organic use, but the company has not paid somebody to test it. So if you have a question, you can always give me a call and I can check into the amendment for you. Okay, the other question is, do you need supplemental nitrogen? Oftentimes, if we've got low organic matter and low total exchange capacity, we are definitely going to need some supplemental nitrogen. And there is a way for you to calculate this, and that is to look at the organic matter that you have. And you can do a little calculation with your organic matter percentage so that you can understand how much organic matter Mother Nature is going to supply for you in the spring. Now, if you have irrigation, we use a multiplier of 15%. If you don't, we use 10%. So let's just say that your organic matter is 6.6%. We're going to multiply that by 15. And that means that we have 99 pounds of nitrogen available to us per acre. And But if we're growing tomatoes, that's not going to be enough. It's not going to be enough because tomatoes need between 140 and 160 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So we would have to calculate our nitrogen amendment by looking at how can we get another 40 to 60 pounds of N. So one of the amendments that we recommend is feather meal. Especially if you need a lot of pounds of nitrogen, feather meal has 13% N in it. So we can calculate, let's just say if we have 400 pounds of feather meal and we multiply by 13%, that's going to deliver 52 pounds of nitrogen. And if we add that to what Mother Nature is going to give you, the 99 plus 52 gives us 151 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So your tomatoes should be happy with that amount. And the nice thing about feather meal is that it's a slow release type of nitrogen that will last the entire season for you. Once you get to about 10% organic matter, your nitrogen supplementation often becomes unnecessary because if you were listening to the math, 10% of organic matter times 15 pounds is enough for your tomato plants. So just think about that when you get your soil report, whether you're going to need a supplemental nitrogen. So oftentimes people are worried about doing their own amendment calculations. It can be very confusing. If you don't want to do the math yourself, many labs will give you amendment recommendations with your soil test. I mentioned UMass does a recommendation for you. I also do soil analysis with either a Logan Labs or another Melic 3 test. And we can and just make sure that your product is safe for organic use. And oftentimes you'll need to avoid phosphorus if you have been putting a lot of compost on your garden. So using a compost made without manure is a good idea. And no fertilizers with phosphorus either. Plenty of compost out there that's made without manure. Okay, if you really want to understand how to do all these calculations, this is an excellent book especially for people who grow their own food. This particular book, The Intelligent Gardener by Steve Solomon, will really answer all those questions and put this really into more layman's terms. They also have a website called growabundant.com, and you can subscribe to that. And with the Logan Lab soil test, you can actually use their calculator for calculating your amendments. It's really a nice perk there. But I highly recommend this book. So do you still want to calculate your own amendments? These would be the items that we would want to address for your soil. Excuse me. So most importantly is the fact that those of you who don't listen to John Kemp, he runs Advancing Eco Agriculture. He's an Amish farmer from Ohio. This is his quote: "Biology supersedes chemistry. Your crops can be successful without chemistry or without all these minerals that I'm talking about, as long as you have abundant microbial communities. Your crops cannot be successful without biology, even if your minerals are well balanced." So that's a very important thought from John Kemp. And there's another video that I've listed here on this slide about managing soil biology. But I think that it's going to be a lot of fun to hear our next speaker talk about that biology. So without further ado, I will stop sharing and see if there's any questions.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, we do have some good questions. One in particular we should start with is, when is a good time to test? Is it the fall? And then, could you tell us a little bit about how long it takes for lab results to usually come back?
Yes. Whenever you take the soil test, make sure to do it the same time every year. I usually do mine in August, September, October, so that I can put down certain amendments in the fall. Certain amendments, it's better to put down in the fall, or 2 to 4, at least 4 weeks before you start planting. And oftentimes that's not possible with our weather, with our soil moisture in the spring. So many people do their soil test in the spring, but many people do it in the fall. But just pick a time and then stick to it. It usually takes the lab, and it depends. Logan Labs is between 5 to 10 days to get a soil test back.
Mhm. Could you recommend, again, repeat the website you recommend for understanding recommendations for soil testing?
Growabundant.com.
Thank you. As well, there's a couple of specific questions. Are there often gardens or farm fields that end up with too much organic matter in their soil?
That's a good question. A lot of urban soils actually have a lot of a very high organic matter in the 20s or 18 to 25 even. And that's because, for example, in the city of Boston, if you want to grow food on a city lot, they require you to soil test, ensure that you don't have any heavy metals. And if you do, you need to put a liner down, and at least 18 inches of non-native soil is usually what people use. And non-native soil is a mixture of loam and maybe some compost, maybe some peat that they're mixing together. And so those soils often have above 18 to 20% organic matter because they've used so much compost in them. But generally, outside of an urban setting, I don't see those high of organic matters.
Mm-hmm. Another question came in about your thoughts about using ground up oyster shells for long-term calcium, a long-term calcium source.
That's a great calcium source. I think that a lot of people are using that and or crab flour for the calcium.
Mm-hmm. Another question, does chicken manure create less phosphorus than cow manure or other manures?
I don't know the answer to that question, but if you have high phosphorus, I would use neither. I don't know which one has more phosphorus, actually.
There's another question specifically about boron, that it's good for some plants, but toxic. It can be toxic. Can you speak a little bit more about applying boron?
Yeah, you have to be a little careful with boron in terms of the quantity and timing of your application. I often there's different percentages in different products. So if you're using the Borax 20 Mule Team, which you can get in the laundry detergent aisle of your grocery store, is a 9 to 10% boron. That's probably the safest one for you to use. And then if you use a product called Soluble, that's 20% boron. So you use half as much of the amount that you would use for borax. And but I think sometimes people like to use a liquid, and those can be a lot safer because their percentages of boron are in the 1 to 2% range. And you're actually, mixing it with water or some other types of nutrients like fish emulsion or, molasses or something like that. And you actually can spray it on the soil, or you can spray it on the plant that needs the boron. And so that can be a very effective plant, but you definitely don't want to overdo it with boron because it can cause problems with plants that you're putting in after you apply boron. I generally will recommend people to use boron in the fall. And so you don't have to worry about it next spring.
Lori mentions that I just got my soil test results back and my macro and micronutrients are way over recommended amount. Cation exchange was 36.6.
Wow.
How can I bring these numbers down?
Well, you don't need to keep applying stuff. That's for sure. You can stop and you'll notice your plants do take out a lot of nutrients, but it could take a couple of years. Hopefully you'll use some cover crops. Oats and buckwheat can be effective in reducing phosphorus amounts if you're using those cover crops. They also are sort of attract bacteria that solubilizes phosphorus. So those are two good cover crops. But the first thing is you just need to don't put anything more on the soil until you can see it balanced out.
Mhm. As you mentioned, cover crops, someone was just interested about, this is their first time planting winter rye into their garden beds, and was hoping you could explain a little bit more about a winter rye cover crop and what to do with it in the spring.
So winter rye is a perennial and it's not going to be killed by the winter. So it's a little bit trickier to deal with. I personally did put some beds down this fall with winter rye, and I'm going to, and I'm no till, so I'm not going to be tilling it in. I'm going to mow it first, as close as I can get it. And then I'm going to put down my tarp, my black tarp. It's black on the top and white underneath. And I'm going to make sure it doesn't grow back. I might leave that on there depending upon the temperature, a week or 2 weeks. And then it should be dead enough to plant. Now I have often planted my plants directly into stubble of mowed cover crops, but not perennial ones. I often have put them in stubble of oats and peas that I've planted in March, mowed it, planted directly into that, but not rye. So rye can be particularly challenging because it's a perennial.
Someone asked if growing in mixed vegetables in raised beds and nutrition needs are different from one plant to the other plant, and perhaps even available nutrients in different beds might differ. How do you account for this when the soil test samples from a few different beds?
In general, they're not going to be that much different. And unless you have, unless you want to test every single bed, I would recommend that you take a plug, or, you're going 6 inches down and then you're taking some of the soil from 6 inches down, and you are combining those samples from many beds into a Ziploc bag that you're going to send to the lab. Unless you have, a lot of time and more money to spend on soil tests, I would recommend that you just do one test and just combine all of your beds. They're not going to be that much different.
Mm-hmm. We're going to wrap up with this sort of two-part question. There's a couple of folks who have very high calcium. One has high magnesium, and basically, are there ways to mitigate that? Does it hurt to use a high calcium lime or Aragonite?
I would not recommend you add any more calcium if you have very high levels of calcium. What you really want to do is add amendments to adjust the deficiencies. That's it. And don't add anything else.
And then just to refocus that question, Crystal is asking if you needed to raise the pH for that, is there something you might be able to use for a high calcium soil?
Well, I think that that's a challenging one. Oftentimes, when we go through this type of training to help people with their soil balancing, we're told not to worry so much about pH, that it will balance itself out. And especially if adding lime is going to be an issue. Aragonite doesn't affect the pH as much. So it's just going to add more calcium. So I would recommend that that you not add anything. Your pH may be also a product of temperature. I often will see people do soil testing when it's a little colder out, and oftentimes the pHs are off. So you may want to just retest and then when you have a question like that, there's another test that you can do called a saturated paste test that tells you the minerals that are actually available. It's like a checking account, whereas the standard soil test is a savings account, and the checking account is what the plant has to spend right now. And that may tell you whether or not calcium is actually even available to the plant. And if it's not showing that it's available, then I might recommend adding calcium regardless of what your standard soil test says.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you, Laura. So we're going to switch over to Marco now.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all that great information. Welcome, Marco.
Hello, hello.
It's my pleasure. If you haven't already found out about Marco, Marco is a natural farmer and founder of Microbes by Marco.
All right. Thank you guys for having me, and great presentation, Laura. Lots of great info. I took about a half a page of notes myself, so I appreciate that. And looks like I'm sharing my screen here. So let's see, let me just get myself situated. All right, my name is Marco Thomas. I am a natural farmer. I have an urban property in Petersburg, Virginia, that is basically an empty lot. And I'm converting that into an urban natural farm, or food forest, as some folks like to call them these days. And today I wanted to just talk about some different ways of using natural farming methods for increasing your soil health. Oops, let me go back. All right, some of you guys have heard of natural farming. Some people have not. What is natural farming? Natural farming, or NF, as I may abbreviate it as we go forward, is a method of plant cultivation which predates the invention of man-made chemical fertilizers. It takes us back to a time when every input the farmer used on their crops was either derived from plants, animals, or the forest, which was growing near their fields. There were no stores, so if you wanted to grow food, you had to be resourceful and use things that you found near your crops, near your land. One of the principles of natural farming is do as nature does. And I know a lot of people have heard that, and it may be maybe not understood what it means, but it can mean many things. Since we're discussing soil health, this means focusing on the collection, cultivation, and health of our soil microorganisms, which work continually to cycle nutrients in our soil. I will use simplified examples from nature to explain the different ways of harvesting and utilizing indigenous microorganisms, or IMO, and the local plants to build our soil health and maximize levels of beneficial microbiology. So basically, in short, if you look at a forest near your property or anywhere, you never need fertilizer on that forest, and it grows big and strong. And the way it does that is by the relationships between the plants and the microbiology in the soil. Indigenous microorganisms. Indigenous microorganisms, also known as IMO, are the foundation of soil health. IMO are the reason a forest never needs fertilizer or any outside inputs to grow strong and healthy. In nature, IMO are at work nonstop, breaking down organic material such as leaves and fruit into readily available plant nutrients. IMO form symbiotic relationships with plant roots. Think mycorrhizal fungi and nitrogen fixing bacteria in legumes. You know, those are direct relationships with soil microbiology and plant roots. The plants produce exudates that are preferred by certain microorganisms, and those microbes in turn reward the plant with nutrients or the ability to absorb more nutrients. So specific plants will release specific root exudates that attract just the microbiology that the plant needs or wants to help it grow. Let's see. Sorry, I lost my place where it was. Natural farmers should look for strong growing deciduous forests and collect IMO at the base of big trees. IMO is collected with partially cooked rice placed in a cedar box or wicker basket and left on the forest soil for approximately 3 days to 1 week, depending on how warm the temperatures are. Once the rice has been inoculated, it is called IMO 1. So when you clear a little space on the forest floor and you set your box of rice, the microbes are going to come up, and they're basically so tiny they're airborne anyway. So they're going to colonize this rice from the forest floor, and then now you can take this colony of inoculated rice back to your garden and use it, you know, to strengthen your soil and build your microbiology in your gardens. So once the IMO has been inoculated, it's called IMO 1, Indigenous Microorganisms 1. So the farmers encouraged to take many different IMO collections from around the region in various seasons and use them to maximize the microbial diversity in their gardens and fields. So in other words, you want to collect microbes from where you are, which is your specific region. You want to go to the mountains. You want to get microorganisms from there because they have different, there's different microorganisms in different regions. And what it is, you want to bring those back to your garden, and that will give you diversity. So now you have mountains microorganisms, you have microorganisms from the coast or the desert area or any of those areas. So everywhere you collect them from, those are going to give you a little bit more diversity. The simplest way to use this IMO 2, remember the IMO 1 rice plus the sugar is now IMO 2. And so you have a shelf-stable biology that you can put on your shelf with the IMO 2. The simplest way to use IMO 2 is roughly 1 to 1,000 or 1 teaspoon per gallon non-chlorinated water, and soil drench your beds. To fully maximize IMO, they should be used to make IMO 3 and IMO 4, which are additional steps in the process, which multiply the microbiology in each step. And if you look at the picture in the slide here, this is a piece of IMO 4, and basically it's soil which has been colonized with microbiology to the point that it's just basically exploding and coming all out, and that's all this white mycelium that you see growing there on it. All right, so still talking on IMO. IMO 1 is when you collect your IMO with par-cooked rice under the strong trees. IMO 2 is when you combine that with rice, as we said. This puts, you combine it with unrefined sugar. This puts the microbes into a dormant state so they can be used later. The sugar pulls the moisture out of the microbe bodies and via osmosis, and then renders them dormant. Once you rehydrate this IMO, those microbes come out of dormancy, and then they start, growing in your beds. IMO 3 is you combine equal parts, and this is somewhat of a compost for some folks that haven't heard of the IMO and things like that. When you go to IMO 3, you're more looking at a pile. It's not a traditional hot compost because you don't want it to get up higher than 125 degrees, but it is a compost in the sense that it's heating up because the microbiology is growing very rapidly. So to make IMO 3, you combine equal parts aged wood chips, cracked grains, or whatever is available to you. Water that with natural farming inputs that we will discuss shortly, because along with your microbiology, you need to be able to feed the microbiology. So those are the inputs we'll be talking about here shortly. So basically you will water with natural farming inputs and IMO2, which is the rice and has all that forest biology. Those are all combined dry, and then add the liquids and then mix to a consistency, not too wet, not too dry, but just where you can't squeeze a handful of water out. Leave that in a pile, and over the course of 14 days, the pile will heat up, microbiology will grow, inoculate it, and you have to turn it to keep your temperature in check. But after about 14 days, you'll have a pile of what you can see, it looks similar to this picture here is IMO3, just like the IMO4, but with less of the garden soil. Okay, so now we've done IMO 1, 2, and 3. Now IMO 4 would be equal parts of the IMO 3 we made, and then your garden soil. So now we're taking that biology and we're inoculating your garden soil. And then now that can be used as kind of basically a supercharged piece of microbiology that you can spread all over your gardens to inoculate them. IMO 5 is now you take your IMO 4, you want to get a fertilizer aspect to it. So now you're doing the same pile, but now you're doing equal parts IMO 4 with a manure, either a high nitrogen source, such as I use alfalfa a lot. I don't use a lot of manure. I don't use any manure. I would use rabbit if I get my hands on some good rabbit, but I don't use a lot of manure. It's nothing wrong with it, but you can use either manure or nitrogen rich source, go through that same heat cycle, and then now you have a fertilizer aspect to your indigenous microorganisms. All right, natural inputs. So when growing any plant, it's important that as plants grow, they are using nutrients and minerals from the soil to do so. This means the farmer must be sure to add things back to the soil in order to replenish what has been potentially lost. Before we get into making and using natural farming inputs, there are just a few things the farmer can do to minimize the loss of organic material, minerals, and nutrients in the soil. A couple of things everyone knows: no-till. Do not pull plants. Instead, leave the soil food web intact and chop plants at the base, allowing the roots to decompose in place. All those roots that you have your tomato plants, if you chop the tomato plants and leave the roots, all those roots will be decomposed well ahead of next season, and they will feed your next round of plants. Chop old plants, spread them over the soil to decompose to act as mulch. So what I do is I do a thing called chop and drop. If I grow tomatoes, I don't necessarily take them away from that growing place at the end of the season. Instead, I may just chop the plants up into small pieces and then just use them to mulch the soil right there in place. Keep the soil mulched with chopped leaves. This helps the surface of the soil stay protected and moist and conducive to nutrient cycling, as well as preventing the soil from becoming hydrophobic and making watering more difficult. So those are just a couple things to do to make your life easier as a farmer, and they don't cost anything, which is a big part of natural farming, is very low cost. Okay, now I just want to run through a couple of the natural inputs real quick. I don't know how we're looking on time, Doug, but I'll just keep it moving.
Yeah, we're good in half an hour.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so we now...
And then we'll do questions.
Okay, yeah, sounds good. All right, so we've talked about our indigenous microorganisms, which increase the microbiology in our soil. And now since we've added so many microorganisms, way more than would naturally be found in the soil, we have to also feed those microorganisms. Normally, trees drop leaves. Those leaves are nutrient cycled by microorganisms. Nutrients are released, and then the tree absorbs that, and then that cycle just continues. In our gardens, it's a little bit different because we're harvesting a lot of the fruit and the veggies, and we're taking a lot of the inputs away. So for that reason, we have to put things back. And we spoke on IMO2, we're good on that. LAB, lactic acid bacteria, it's considered the police in natural farming in a way. If you have imbalance in your soil, or if you have hard packed clay soils, or any soil that needs to be softened, lactic acid bacteria, which is made from milk, rice wash water, which is really easy to make. It's a great input to add to your garden. A lot of folks maybe have heard of fermented plant juice, FPJ. Plant food plus growth hormones and enzymes. This is made from any fast growing leafy plant. And basically what you're doing in a lot of these natural farming inputs is some of them are using sugar to ferment, and then some of them are decomposition type inputs using just water and microbes. But for the FPJ, it's 1 part plant, 1 part unrefined sugar, ferment for 5 days, and then gravity strain that juice, that extract. And then now that can be used as 1 part to 1,000, very powerful. So a teaspoon per gallon of FPJ when you're feeding your garden. Raw vinegar, also combined with the FPJ, is a great input. Needs to be diluted. Raw vinegar made from the strained leftovers of FPJ. It diluted, it thickens the wax layer of plant leaves and makes them more resistant to pests. And it also makes their stems stronger and more flexible. So FPJ at 1 to 1,000, raw vinegar 1 to 1,000. And then the next one, OHN, which is herbal nutrient. Those 3 combined make a natural farming maintenance solution, which is something that is kind of like used to maintain your garden on a weekly or every other week basis. So the FPJ, the vinegar, and the OHN are a maintenance. The LAB used as needed. And then going on down the line, WCP, water soluble phosphate, builds plant structure. And the way I make that is we char animal bones, large mammal bones, preferably like cow, deer. I've even, we've had roadkills, and I'll be able to use the deer bones. And basically you char them to a biochar more or less, and then you combine with vinegar for 10 days. And then now that vinegar pulls out that phosphate out of the animal bones, and that's another input to use. Fish amino acid. A lot of people have heard of fish hydrolysate, which is it's an okay input, but to take it a step farther, fish amino acid is full spectrum. It's the entire fish. It's high in nitrogen that is readily available to plants. Promotes a lot of vegetative growth. You definitely wouldn't want to use FAA when your plants are producing fruit or flowers. And FAA is also fermented. It's made with equal parts fish, unrefined sugar. IMO is tossed in there, and then that is allowed to ferment for about a year. So FAA is a long input to make, but once you have it, it's a very great input. I mean, it'll give nitrogen. Any gardener that's used it will tell you can see from one day to the next how the difference in greening. Like these things are very plant available, like right now, a lot of them, which makes which makes them so good. Just catch up on my slide. Okay. WCA, water soluble calcium. We were talking about calcium. A lot of people, know we have deficiencies in calcium from time to time. One good resource. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I go back? All right. WCA, water soluble calcium. You can make this input with take crushed eggshells, just char them slightly over heat to get them brittle, combine with vinegar, and then that vinegar will pull the calcium out of the eggshells and give you a liquid input that's readily available calcium. And then There are many others, but I'll finish the inputs kind of off on the natural input side. These are the sugar fermented items, and then seawater, which a lot of people don't realize, but diluted seawater. Seawater contains pretty much every micronutrient and macro that a plant needs to grow in various amounts, but it's a very great resource. I use seawater. Probably 1 part to 500 or even a little stronger sometimes. You'd be surprised your plants really react to seawater well. Okay. And I know this is a lot, and I'm just trying to get a lot into it. This and goes, hopefully I'm going slow enough for my interpreter. But we'll keep it moving. Water soluble liquid fertilizers. I don't know if anybody has heard of Jadam, J-A-D-A-M. I'm sure a lot of you have. A Jadam is somewhat of a offshoot of natural farming. And what Jadam does is they say, okay, we focus more on water and microbes to do water soluble fertilizers and very low cost. So the best thing to grow a plant is a plant. And what I mean by that is a plant has everything that it needs to grow already inside of itself and its fruit. You know, if you think about it, if you're looking at a tomato plant with tomatoes, every nutrient that plant would need is in that plant and that fruit. So it's super easy and inexpensive way to make liquid fertilizers, or JLF, Jadam liquid fertilizer, is to add half plant material to any container, fill the rest with water, and toss in a handful of IMO or garden soil and just cover it loose. And JLF can be made from any plant that you grow and can be customized to fit your garden. I keep several of these feed barrels always going. They can be used after 2 weeks and continue to get better and more nutritious as the organic material breaks down. If you see in the picture, that is just an example of some comfrey and alfalfa, JLF, which is a liquid fertilizer. And not only do they have the fertilizer aspect, the microbiology in these is just out of this world. They don't smell great, you know, so if you're doing a JLF, put that back towards the back of your garden, you know, but they're really a great resource and they're not horrible. You keep them somewhat loose lid, and then once the microbiology starts breaking them down, they're bearable. And as I like to say, embrace your funk, you know, because that funk is what's giving you that life and putting that into your soil. A few different options for liquid fertilizers. If you're looking for, you know, for nitrogen, just start a barrel. Start adding comfrey, alfalfa. You can do one with fish, stinging nettles. I have one that I do just weeds. When I weed, my wife likes flower beds, so I grow a lot of flowers for her. And when those beds get weeded, I just toss those weeds right into a JLF bucket with water. And then that's just nutrients that goes right back into my garden, free of charge. Phosphorus, you can do lentils, squash, and pumpkin. I collected a bunch of pumpkin at the end of last fall and did some pumpkin barrels. They'll give me a lot of nice phosphate this year. You can even do rock phosphates, you know, and those kinds of things with the water the same way. And what they'll do is the microbes will just break those minerals down a little bit faster than they would if they were just out in the garden. And then potassium, you know, bananas, you can do potash, there's so many different variations of these, and they're really easy to do and they're really worth doing. All right, benefits of natural farming, guys. Low cost. Like if you don't want to go out and be buying bags of this and bags, you can get into it really relatively easy. No environmental impact. You know, everything I make, all the inputs, if I was to just dump them in the river, it'd just be more microbes and more plant material in the river. There's nothing negative about it. And a lot of the natural farming inputs with sugar are actually edible to the human body and beneficial to us too. JLFs, avoid all that, because if you can see the microscope slide to the right there, that's just a bunch of fungal hyphae that I scoped in one of my alfalfa liquid fertilizers. That was one that I aerated, and then right before I aerated, I check it, and once it's at peak, I use it. They're very easy, and you can start using them right away. So that's pretty much the last slide I had. And just one thing to mention, when I started my urban garden, as Laura said, some great points. I wasn't sure what the soil was like, so I did test the soil that was there. It was fairly poor. It had been just a vacant lot for many years. The property is from 1890, so there's no telling what was ever done there. So my method there is all my beds, I build my own soil, and then I use the hugelkultur technique, which is on top of the ground. So I do hugelkultur, logs, twigs, wood chips, the soil that I built and had tested, and then now I grow. And like Laura said, the soil I built, I did have it tested at first. The first year I built it, just to see where I was at with all my parameters. And then since then, I've just been only using natural farming methods, and I haven't had a soil test. And thankfully, my plants have not shown many deficiencies, if any. And so I'll just keep playing, using natural farming. And then if I start picking up any deficiencies, then I can go back to a soil test and kind of work from there. But that's kind of the way, natural farming looks at, soil health, at least from my point of view. So.
That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, we have some excellent questions. So I think I want to start off with a question from Andrew. It's sort of a two-part question. Is there a way that we can, look at a collection of indigenous microorganisms and identify what we're looking at? Andrew said they found traps with hot pink and a curry chicken colored, mold.
Yes.
And, the second part of that is like, will all IMOs be beneficial, or, should we be concerned about spreading potentially pathogenic, fungi?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of people ask that because a lot of how we were brought up, and it's just normal. We see mold on bread. We brought up, oh, mold bad, or fuzzy bad, things like that. One of the principles with natural farming is good and bad are the same when things are in balance. And what I tell people all the time is I've taken lots of collections, and they look all different colors of the rainbow. Some of them are all white and nice and perfectly white every time. Some of them are just a rainbow of colors. And what I say is you collected what was there, and somewhat you have to trust the process, because you collected what was there. What's there is growing healthy forests. You're going to bring that back in the same balance that you collected, and then you're going to propagate it and multiply it in that same method. And so I don't worry about good and bad, because every single piece of soil has something bad in it. Anthrax is probably in every bit of soil, but it's not in numbers that are out of balance, so it's all healthy. So I don't worry about the colors. I actually embrace that as a little bit of diversity.
Mm-hmm. Cecily asked if you need different versions, would you want, they asked if you need a sunny version or a shady version. I think, in that fact, they're trying to consider, different locations to gather their IMOs and uses. Is there any difference there that you would see?
Yeah, that's a great question too. What I do is I take collections, like I trade with people around the country. My mindset is this: there are two ways to think about it. Some people say, well, you should only collect what's indigenous right around your garden. All right. My thing is, I take collections. I have things from the desert. People sent me IMO2 from the desert, from up north, from south, east, west, all over. And so when I take that microbiology from the desert and I put it in my garden, will all of it survive? No. However, some of it will survive. And what does survive has now told me it's fine living in the desert, so it has a high drought tolerance. And now that it's living here, it's told me, hey, I don't mind living in Virginia as well. So that's why I encourage taking multiple from the sunny side of your garden, from the shady side, when it's hot, when it's cold, take all those different collections, because each different environmental condition is conducive for different microorganisms. So all that will build your diversity.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So we're thinking a little bit about, fermented plant juices. Could someone use their, vegetable scraps or food scraps from their kitchen to make fermented plant juice?
Okay, technically, yes, you can. Okay, if you say you have bananas and they're going bad, could you make an FPJ? Sure. The thing though, what I would say is I save my FPJs for my fresh local fruit, because what happens is there's biology that covers that whole fruit, you know what I mean? And a lot of times when you get this fruit shipped from overseas, it may not necessarily, it wasn't picked at a time where the enzymes and everything are ripe in it. So you may be making an FPJ that's inferior than, say, if you were to go and grab some local persimmons that just harvested and then do an FPJ. That's going to be a lot more active FPJ than if you were to just use old scraps. But for old kitchen scraps, I do a JLF, which is the water and then the old fruit. And then now you're going to still get those benefits like that.
Great. Yeah, the JLF. Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
And as you mentioned, some of the weeds that you put into your, I think JLF, are there any that you would not put in there?
No, I can't think of any that I would not put in there, because the thing is, what happens is when they go in those JLFs, it just totally transforms it. With the way the microbes are, like you put it in there and it looks like weeds. When you bringing it out, it looks like green soup. So it just takes it to all the way down to as small as breaks it down to that small component. And I think that there isn't anything I wouldn't put in it. Probably just pine or things like that, which would be real stringent or something.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about using seaweed in some of your preparations or as mulch in your garden?
Oh, I love it. I think that's great. I think seaweed's a wonderful input. I have of course, seaweed JLF. I got everything JLF, but I also have seaweed that I made FPJ out of seaweed and then vinegar out of it. I love seaweed. It's on the same lines as the seawater. It just has so many beneficial nutrients and things in it. And I encourage people to collect that.
Mm-hmm. And Julia asked if you can use molasses in the place of unrefined sugar in any of these recipes.
You can, however, I discourage molasses. And the only reason is molasses doesn't have as much osmotic pressure as sugar. So it's not going to pull as much of the moisture out as the unrefined sugar was. And sometimes molasses, because it's so if you will, wet, you get a little bit more growth on the tops of your FPJs and things than you will with sugar. Can it be done? Yes, because one of the principles of natural farming is use what's available. So it's going to beat the heck out of going to the store and buying a fertilizer. If that's all you have, definitely go with molasses. But if you can get the sugar, the unrefined, then go there.
And then thinking of, again, adding, all of these plants into your water, how long do you want it to stay in that bucket before you're going to use it? And how often are you, maintaining or stirring it?
So I've done the literature says after, Master Cho Jadam. He says after 2 weeks you can start using them, and I've checked that. So what I did was I did a little study. I did JLF after 2 weeks, and I checked the 6 month, and I checked the 1 year under microscope. The 2 week was actually the most active microbially. The 6 month less microbially, and then the 1 year was a lot less. And then what I came to realize was that as the microbes broke down the organic material in the solution, they ran out of food, and then they started feeding on each other. And then at the 1 year mark, there was really only some of your larger rotifers or ciliates were still left in the JLF, whereas the 2 week had like bacteria like crazy, and then the 6 month just a little less. So they're good. Every stage of them is good, but what I would recommend, knowing that after a year they kind of consume everything, just keep recharging them. Just keep putting veggies, keep putting plant material in them, keep them topped up, and I think that keeps that microbial activity up. But they can be used pretty quick.
Mm-hmm. And to go back to the IMO a little bit, what size box would you use for your IMO collection? You mentioned a cedar box.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. Roughly, 12-inch by 12-inch box would be perfect. Something not too big, not too small. You want about 1 inch of rice, maybe 1.5 inches thick. Definitely don't press the rice in, toss it in loose, kind of where that airflow can get in there. And then for your box, as long as it's just kind of got some cracks and airflow, it doesn't have to be cedar. Cedar lasts longer. Wicker makes a great box, and I even took some bamboo and split it and then did 2 halves and kind of put rice in the middle of that, and that works as well. Another note, if you don't have a box, I've done them with pizza boxes or cardboard box. So anything that you can do that's going to let some air come through and collect those microbes will work okay.
How important is the rice that you use? Could you use other grains?
Yeah, rice is common because we throw, a lot of folks throw that away, and it's a really good source. I have a friend that used sorghum grain. I'm actually going to grow my own sorghum because I want to grow the grain, then collect the IMO, and just kind of just keep fine tuning my process. But sorghum works. I think a lot of grains that have some kind of moisture, kind of consistency like rice, but for the price, I mean, rice is going to be your best bet.
Okay, great. And I think we'll sort of wrap up here with this question. Do you have any favorite resources you'd like to share with us, specifically from Ethan about making water soluble calcium? But if you have any other natural farming resources you'd like to share, and if you'd like to talk about some of the products that you make and sell, now would be a good time to do that too.
Okay, yeah, I do because I make all this stuff. Sometimes I have some surplus. Some great, like to be honest, my Instagram is a really good source. Marco_is_growing is great. And then if you just search JADAM, Jadam, and then search, I like Natural Farming Hawaii, has a great site. NF Hawaii or Natural Farming Hawaii. They have a great site. And then and I have a website, microbesbymarco.com, where I have a few products on there, but I would much rather teach you and see you making stuff. So if you guys reach out to me on Instagram or anything, I'll be sure to answer questions and stuff like that.
Great. And that brings us right to 8:30. So I want to respect all of your time, and thank you all for being here. Thank you, Laura, for that great insights, and thank you, Marco, for all the information. So I want to thank you all. I look forward to seeing you next time.